on both the modern left and amongst modern Islamists, there is this sense that the Crusades were one of the great crimes, you know, indicative of a sickness in the West, which has always been hostile to Islam, has always had this violent tendency. They are seen almost as the kind of original sin of Western society. That's how they're talked about in contemporary discussion. You have a very interesting, I hesitate to say hot take, but an interesting deviant understanding of the Crusades in terms of how they're currently discussed. Give us a sense of how you understand that period in history. What really happened then?
Sure, and I'll just start it off by saying, while I agree with what you're saying, the reality is my understanding of the Crusades is actually in keeping with how people understood Crusades for centuries. And what the mainstream understanding of them today that you outlined by Muslims and leftists and whatever, that is the fabricated and basically revisionist understanding. So if anything, my understanding is just traditional and in keeping with how they were always understood. And how they were always understood is that they were warfare, they were just wars against hostile enemies who were engaged at that time in extremely atrocious behavior against Christians. And so right before the First Crusade, I just touched on briefly how Islam had conquered so much, according to the estimates, if you look at maps and what they eventually conquered of Christian territories, it's about 3/4 of the Christian world. And right before the First Crusade, they were engaged, Muslims, especially in the guise of the Seljuk Turks, who were ascendants at this time, were engaged in mass atrocities all throughout the Holy Land, which they had recently annexed from the Fatimids of Egypt. And they were killing and slaughtering, according again to contemporary sources, literally tens of thousands of Christians in Asia Minor, especially Armenians, Greeks. Also, they were engaged in horrific atrocities against European pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land. Rape, extortion, just, wanted destruction. They'd barge into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and abuse the patriarch and beat him up and urinate on the altar, break, crucifixes. So that sort of thing was going on. And back in those days, European Christians actually cared about that sort of thing. They cared about religion. They didn't like seeing their faith dishonored and their co-religionists abused and killed, actually. So that's what the First Crusade was. It was a response to that. And it was considered a completely just war. Islam had conquered formerly Christian regions. The entire Holy Land was Christian, including Jerusalem. When Islam came along and conquered Jerusalem in 637, it was basically, since the 300s, it had been turned into a holy site full of pilgrimage sites under Constantine the Great, who had created the Holy Sepulchre and all these different monuments that Christians from Europe and elsewhere would come and visit. So all of that was under attack, under assault. Christians were being slaughtered. The emperor in the East, the Byzantine emperor, called for aid. And out of it came the First Crusade. It's actually one of the most altruistic of all endeavors historically, much more than our wars by far. Okay, much, much more. And the people who engaged in it, the Crusaders, basically engaged in great sacrifices. They gave up their lands to mortgage their journey, their armed pilgrimage, as it was understood. Most of them died on the way. A lot of them did. Starvation, disease, famine, attacks from nature, attacks from wild animals, going through on this, long trek. And finally, when they got there, skeleton crew, they managed to actually liberate and re-Christianize Jerusalem. And even then, a lot of them didn't want to stay. It was seen as a death sentence to stay afterwards. So the person, for example, Godfrey of Bouillon, who became the first guardian of the Holy Sepulchre, because he wouldn't take on the role of king, saying famously that I will not wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns. To him, he was a duke, of Lorraine. He could have gone back but he gave it all away and lived there. And lo and behold, he died after 1 year of constant warfare with Muslims. So this was by far one of the most altruistic endeavors in history. It was understood that way for centuries, including by early Protestants. I mean, now, of course, it's so condemned by everyone, including even Catholics, and is seen as this extreme evil violence because of the way it's been mangled and distorted. People don't tell you what built up and led to it. They just make it sound like all these Europeans just decided out of the blue to go to the Middle East and colonize it, and they were racist and Islamophobes, and that's what drove them. No, it's the exact opposite, as I had mentioned, and so yeah, that would be my response to why I understand the Crusades the way I do, which is the correct way, and why so many people don't, because they've been lied to intentionally to demonize the Crusades. Because the last thing that the powers that be want any Christian, American, Western Christian, to see as part of their heritage is the Crusades, because lest they emulate that sort of thing. So of course it has to be demonized.
I'm currently reading a biography of Henry V, and it's amazing the men in that kind of period who had been on crusades, the extent to which they were seen as heroes, as people who were defending the honor of Christianity and Christian people who were under threat. It's so starkly different to how we look at those events now. I want to ask you, you've touched on it there already, but what has brought about this misunderstanding of the Crusades? And I guess you could broaden it out a little bit into what's brought about this, our misunderstanding of Islam, because do you think this is the influence of Islamist thinking in the West, which is increasingly influential in our societies, Islamist activism, Islamist arguments? Have they convinced us to look at the Crusades in a different way, or is it something that comes from in the West itself, that kind of sense of cultural shame, historical shame, looking back on our past as just a long litany of crimes against humanity? Where do you see the dynamic in terms of spreading this misunderstanding of that period?
Its origins, certainly it begin in the West itself. Muslims, Islamists exploiting it. I'm sure that happens all the time, but I think that's very much secondary to the impact of the intrinsic impact within the West itself. Muslims are basically riding that wave, but the wave is already there. I think it goes back to this idea, which, starts growing in the 60s maybe, but, it has precursors before that, which is, the root of all evil is Europe, is the West, Christianity. The ideas that you were mentioning, how bad the Crusades are, the Inquisition, slavery, because nobody ever enslaved anyone until white people came along. So all these ideas really fermented and really became dominant in the 60s. And then, of course, Hollywood took them and really went extreme. Okay, way more than what academics were saying. Of course, they overly sensationalized it, and it would become. But then it became, because of course now academia is part of Hollywood in a way, especially the way it's being taught, and so it's all worked together to basically demoralize Western people, to make them disavow their heritage. To see, only nothing but evil and ills coming from the periods that we're talking about, when Christians actually behaved like Christians. And so it's definitely, and I'm sure this is entirely by design. I already touched on it before, because I think the last thing that certain people or certain elements want is to have Christians in the West stop being what they are, which is doormats, because that's the form of Christianity that is, of course, promoted in the West very heavily, which is your religion is basically to appease everyone else and lay down and be walked over, right? It wasn't like that before. So, and that's, I think, the whole idea. They want to make sure you keep thinking that way. That way you are very much agreeable to any agenda that anyone has. And you pat yourself on the back and say, look, I'm holy and I'm virtuous. It works really perfectly. And at the same time, they definitely don't want you to remember the sorts of things that I'm talking about, that I write about, the Crusades, that mentality, that Christians could act that way and believe in that sense. Because if Christians in mass actually reclaimed their more robust heritage, I think that would spell a lot of trouble for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the UK at the moment, I want to ask you about the UK specifically. The contrast between the kind of current wimpishness of Christianity and sometimes quite arrogant approach taken by Islam it's a striking contrast. So Christians are constantly self-flagellating for their supposed historic crimes, whereas Muslims engage in acts of public prayer that sometimes look more like political statements rather than religious ones, and we have all these kinds of tensions going on in our society and no one knows what to do about them.